I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into my driveway and saw a wooden fence slicing straight through my yard like a scar. Overnight, someone had claimed a chunk of my property as if I didn't exist. The HOA insisted it was within their rights. Neighbors whispered that I should just let it go, and every explanation I asked for only made the board more defensive, more desperate, more hostile. But the moment I opened my deed, everything changed, and suddenly, the HOA wasn't so confident anymore. Before the chaos started, life in the neighborhood felt almost predictable. The kind of place where people wave politely while unloading groceries, where weekend lawnmowers hummed in the distance like a steady, harmless background track, and where the HOA mostly operated like a distant formality. A quiet reminder taped to the bulletin board about trash bins or seasonal decorations. For years, I believed I had figured out the rhythm of this place. I worked from home, kept my property neat, and rarely interacted with the board beyond the occasional newsletter. It wasn't perfect, but it was stable. And stability was something I valued more than anything. My house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac lined with identical roofs and carefully trimmed hedges. The property wasn't large, but it was mine entirely, every inch of it purchased with the savings I had scraped together over a decade. The side yard was my favorite part. A wide, open strip of green where sunlight reached the ground uninterrupted. I used it for everything: early morning coffee, quick workouts, small family gatherings. It was quiet, private, and peaceful, and I never imagined that a single plank of wood could change the way I viewed all of it. The HOA was always there, hovering just enough to remind everyone who really dictated the rules. None of their letters had ever bothered me much. They usually addressed harmless concerns, a reminder about holiday lights coming down by January, an overly enthusiastic neighbor's lawn ornaments, or a stray trash can left out too long. Annoying, sure, but manageable. There was nothing that made me think the board would ever turn into a looming force in my life. But looking back, the warning signs had been building slowly, almost quietly, like cracks forming beneath paint. The board had recently changed leadership, new faces, new energy, new priorities. They talked a lot about property uniformity and structural consistency, terms that sounded harmless until they were suddenly used to justify decisions that didn't feel harmless at all. Whispers began to spread that the new president had big plans, that they wanted tighter control, that enforcement had become their passion project, rather than a simple volunteer duty. I didn't pay much attention. It wasn't my problem, or so I thought. At the annual meeting, which I skipped, because those gatherings always devolved into arguments about grass length and mailbox styles, the board approved what they called a boundary clarification initiative. It was supposed to ensure all lot lines were clearly marked, preventing disputes and creating a uniform neighborhood appearance. It sounded unnecessary but harmless. Most people ignored it. I ignored it, too, not realizing it would eventually become the center of the storm. Around the same time, one of my neighbors mentioned seeing board members walking the property lines with clipboards, measuring tapes, and flags. They weren't subtle about it, but they also weren't exactly transparent. They never sent out notices explaining the purpose. They simply walked through yards like inspectors with an invisible checklist. I tried not to overthink it. After all, my lot had been surveyed when I bought the house. Everything had been confirmed, recorded, and marked. Nothing should have been up for debate. But the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted. Some residents grew nervous, asking questions, trying to understand what the board planned to do. with the information they were collecting. Others didn't care enough to worry. And then, there were a few who seemed thrilled by the idea of more structure, more restrictions, more oversight. The kind of personalities who thrived under rules and enforcement because it gave them a sense of power, even if that power came at their neighbor's expense. Still, nothing truly alarming happened. Not yet. Life continued almost normally. I kept my yard maintained, paid my dues on time, and stayed out of drama. I believed that if I respected the rules would respect me back. That illusion shattered the morning I returned home to find a wooden fence splitting my yard in two. No notice, no warning, no explanation, just a structure that didn't belong, stabbing straight through the middle of my property, like someone had decided to redraw the map of my life without consulting the person who lived there. I stood frozen, stunned by how quickly things had changed. A fence wasn't a small mistake. A fence wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. It hinted at something deeper. Something the HOA had decided, planned, and executed behind closed doors. And in that moment, with the sun casting long shadows across the freshly planted posts, I realized this wasn't going to be a simple conversation or a friendly clarification. Something had shifted in the balance of power. And my quiet neighborhood was about to become the battleground for a conflict I never asked for, and certainly wasn't prepared to face. I just didn't know yet how far the board was willing to go, or how much they had to lose if the truth came out. At first, I thought the fence was an error, a simple mix-up, maybe a contractor who measured from the wrong marker. Mistakes happened. Miscommunication happened. I tried to convince myself the situation was still salvageable, that a calm conversation would clear everything up. But the moment I contacted the HOA office, the tone of everything shifted. Their response wasn't apologetic. It wasn't even neutral. It was defensive. Sharp, clipped, and almost rehearsed, as if they had been waiting for me to notice. They told me the fence was part of a new lot realignment, a term I had never heard before, and claimed it had been approved months earlier. I asked for documentation, and they said it was in process. I asked for the survey used to justify it, and they said it was under review. Every question I asked was met with another vague answer, always wrapped in the same message. The fence was staying. That was the moment my frustration turned into suspicion. Within days, notices began appearing in my mailbox. Small, seemingly insignificant fines for yard encroachment, unauthorized plant placement, and improper boundary maintenance. None of them made sense. My yard had been perfectly compliant for years. Now, suddenly, it was a problem. One of the notices even accused me of obstructing HOA work by tampering with the boundary, even though I hadn't touched a single post. It felt like they were building a case against me, paper by paper, fine by fine. What started as a fence was becoming a web. I walked the neighborhood trying to understand whether I was the only target, and that's when the whispers began. People who once waved now avoided eye contact. Some looked guilty, as if they knew something they didn't want to admit. A few sympathetic neighbors quietly mentioned that the HOA had started reassessing property lines, and that certain board members had been unusually fixated on mine. One of them, the new HOA president, lived directly behind me. That detail lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. Over the next weeks, the tension escalated. Every time I stepped outside, I felt watched. Board members walked past my house, more often than coincidence could explain, peering over the fence as if inspecting their handiwork. They never spoke to me. They only observed, silently, like someone making sure their plan was unfolding exactly as intended. Then came the largest fine yet, an accusation that my shed, which had sat untouched in the same place since the day I moved in, was now violating setback requirements. They gave me 7 days to move it or face compounding daily penalties. The timing was deliberate. If the fence's new boundary was taken at face value, the shed suddenly appeared to be much closer to the lot line than it actually was. It was clear the board wasn't just shifting the boundary. They were trying to create violations to justify it. The pressure tightened with every letter. I tried contacting the HOA again, this time insisting on speaking with the president directly. The assistant told me the president was unavailable due to ongoing neighborhood concerns. A phrase so vague it almost sounded insulting. When I requested the minutes from the meeting where the fence project had supposedly been approved, I received a heavily redacted document, entire paragraphs replaced with thick black bars. Even the date stamps looked suspicious. The message was obvious: stop asking questions. But stopping wasn't an option anymore. The more they pushed, the more determined I became. What had started as confusion was now a fight for my property, my home, and honestly, my sense of control over my own life. Then, one night, something happened that made everything feel much more intentional and much more personal. I came home late and saw 2 HOA board members standing at the edge of my property with flashlights, pointing at the fence and then at the ground, as if marking positions. When they realized I saw them, they didn't greet me. They didn't explain. They just walked away quickly, avoiding my eyes. It was the kind of behavior people displayed when they were caught doing something they knew they shouldn't be doing. By that point, the situation had shifted from inconvenient to alarming. I decided it was time to pull out the original documents from when I purchased the home. The survey, the plat map, the legal descriptions. Everything I had stored away in a tidy folder, never imagining I would have to use them. And when I laid them out on my dining table, one thing became clear: the fence was not on the boundary. Not close. Not debatable. It was nearly 4 feet inside my property. 4 feet. In a tight suburban neighborhood, 4 feet wasn't a simple mistake. It was a land grab. But if the survey was so clear, why was the HOA so insistent? Why were they so confident? Why did they seem almost eager to intimidate me into accepting their version of the boundary? The next morning, I printed copies of the documents and delivered them to the HOA office. The receptionist accepted the packet without expression, promising to pass it on to the board. Her tone was barren. No empathy, no concern, no acknowledgement of the seriousness of what I had just given her. Just cold professionalism. 2 days later, I received a response. But it wasn't what I expected. Instead of addressing the documents, the board sent me a violation notice claiming I had installed unapproved structures. Supposedly referencing the survey stakes I had placed temporarily to confirm the real line. They fined me again, more aggressively this time, and informed me that further violations could result in a lion against my home. They were escalating. The more evidence I gathered, the more desperate they became to shut me down. A few neighbors approached me quietly, almost fearfully, warning me that the board had a reputation for retaliating against problem members. They told me stories of residents who challenged the HOA and ended up buried in fines, dragged into hearings, or publicly shamed at meetings. None of them wanted to get involved. They wished me luck, then hurried away, as if even standing next to me made them vulnerable. The HOA wasn't just a board. It was a power system. And challenging it had consequences. Things reached a boiling point the week I scheduled a private survey to establish the official boundaries. The moment the surveyor arrived, the HOA president marched over from across the street and demanded to know why unauthorized surveying activity was occurring. The confrontation was icy, tense, and laced with the kind of authority that comes from someone who has gotten their way for far too long. The surveyor, unimpressed, continued his work, and when he finished, his face told me everything I needed to know before he spoke. The fence wasn't just misplaced. The HOA's so-called realignment had no basis whatsoever. The boundary was exactly where the original documents said it was. The fence was illegal, plain and simple. Word spread quickly, and tension thickened around the cul-de-sac like fog. Some neighbors watched from their windows. Others stepped outside but pretended to check their mail, their eyes scanning the scene with uneasy curiosity. The HOA president turned red, his posture stiff as he walked away without a word. Within hours, I received an email from the board demanding a mandatory compliance hearing. They framed it as a discussion about my hostility toward the HOA and property disruptions, twisting the narrative so drastically it made my stomach turn. Instead of acknowledging their mistake, they were doubling down, trying to paint me as the aggressor. And then, just when I thought the situation couldn't escalate further, I received a letter taped to my door. Handwritten, anonymous, filled with veiled warnings. It said that fighting the HOA won't end the way you think, and that others have tried and lost more than they expected. The message was chilling, not because of the words themselves, but because of the implication. Someone was watching, someone was angry, and someone wanted me to back down. But fear has a strange way of transforming into resolve when pushed far enough. I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything they had done. Not after what I had discovered tucked away in the public records office. A discovery that would turn the entire situation upside down and expose why the HOA was so desperate to steal those 4 feet of land. Because what I found in those files didn't just confirm the boundary. It revealed a massive oversight the HOA had been hiding for years. One that could unravel their biggest development project, threaten their authority, and expose the president's personal financial stake in expanding his backyard under the guise of a realignment. And once I had that information, the HOA's panic was only just beginning. The night before the compliance hearing felt heavier than any night I had ever spent in that house. Every sound outside made me tense. The rumble of a passing truck, the sharp snap of a twig, the low murmur of voices drifting across the cul-de-sac. It was as though the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next, waiting to see whether I would fold under the pressure or walk straight into the fire the HOA had built for me. But I wasn't walking into that hearing empty-handed. I had collected every document, every survey, every record from the county office. Among them, one particular set of filings stood out. Not because they were bold or dramatic, but because they were subtle, easily overlooked, and devastatingly incriminating. They revealed that the HOA president had previously applied for a backyard expansion permit that had been denied due to setback requirements. The denied request overlapped almost perfectly with the 4-foot section of land they had just stolen from my property. The fence wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It was a scheme, quiet, deliberate, and selfishly motivated. And tomorrow, I would expose it in front of the entire board. The morning of the hearing, the air buzzed with tension. Neighbors stood outside pretending to tend to their yards or walk their dogs, but their eyes followed me. As I made my way to the community center, the building itself felt colder than usual, almost sterile, like a courtroom stripped of warmth. Inside, the HOA board sat in a row behind a long table, their expressions identical: stiff, guarded, and ready for battle. The president sat in the center, his hands clasped tightly, knuckles pale. He refused to look at me, staring instead at the paperwork in front of him, as though it held the power to erase everything I knew. The room filled quickly. Residents trickled in, some out of curiosity, others out of concern, and a few, I suspected, hoping to see me fall. Chairs scraped against the tile floor, whispers spread like ripples in a pond, and the fluorescent lights hummed above us with an almost mocking intensity. Finally, the president cleared his throat and announced that the meeting would begin. Their opening statement was a rehearsed performance. Slow, authoritative, coded in manufactured patience. They accused me of boundary violations, interference with HOA projects, noncompliance, and harassment of board members. They painted me as a rogue homeowner, trying to undermine the board's authority, twisting every action I had taken into something malicious or disruptive. With each accusation, something inside me tightened. But it wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve. When they finished, all eyes turned to me. For a moment, the silence felt suffocating, like the room was waiting for me to crack under pressure. Instead, I calmly placed my folder of documents on the table. I began with the survey, the official one, the one conducted by a licensed professional only days earlier. The room rustled with muted gasps as I explained that the fence trespassed nearly 4 feet onto my property. I laid out the deed, the plat map, the original boundary markers, each piece adding weight to the truth. The board shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that betrayed their confidence. But I wasn't finished. Next, I revealed the discovery that had changed everything. The permit request the HOA president had quietly filed years earlier. Denied. Declined. Marked unapproved due to insufficient setbacks. A request that, if approved, would have required the extra 4 feet of land the fence had conveniently absorbed. Gasps rippled through the room, louder this time, less controlled. People leaned forward in their seats. The president stiffened, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. The other board members stared at him, their confusion unmistakable. Some of them clearly learning this information for the first time, I continued, explaining how the so-called lot realignment initiative had no supporting documentation, no recorded approval, no legitimate survey to justify it. The redacted meeting minutes were displayed for what they were: a poorly concealed attempt to hide decisions made outside of proper channels. The fines, the harassment, the anonymous letter, the sudden hostility, all of it formed a clear pattern. The fence wasn't HOA business. It was personal business, disguised as authority, enforced through intimidation, and executed behind the board's back. Whispers erupted across the room. Some residents stared at the president with shock, others with anger. One board member whispered something sharply in his direction, but he didn't answer. He sat frozen, motionless, a man watching the facade he had carefully constructed crumble in real time. But the final blow came when I pulled out the last document. Statement from the county inspector, confirming that no new surveys had been submitted, no property line adjustments filed, and no construction permits approved for fencing near my lot. For the first time since the hearing began, the president's composure broke. His face flushed red, his breathing quickened, and his hands trembled slightly on the table. He tried to speak, but no words came out. When he finally managed to say something, it was a weak, muttered claim that the documents were taken out of context. But the room had already turned against him. Residents demanded explanations. Board members looked furious, betrayed, and blindsided. The vice president reached for the documents, scanning them with wide eyes and growing disbelief. The tension surged until the room burst into overlapping voices. Accusations, demands, confusion, outrage. I stood there at the center of it, no longer the isolated target, but the person who had finally exposed the truth. In a desperate attempt to regain control, the president slammed his hand on the table, calling for order. The sound echoed sharply through the room, snapping everyone into silence. His expression twisted into something between anger and panic as he insisted that the board had acted appropriately, that everything had been documented, that I was misrepresenting the situation. But his voice wavered. His confidence cracked, and the room heard it. One board member quietly asked him where the original surveys were kept. Another demanded to know why she had never seen the permit denial before. The vice president said nothing at first, then calmly stated that an internal investigation might be necessary. It was the word, investigation, that finally broke him. The president's face drained of color. He tried to argue, to regain footing, to blame me for stirring chaos. But every excuse sounded weaker than the last. He stood suddenly, knocking over his chair, and stormed out of the room without another word, leaving the meeting in stunned, echoing silence. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the air itself had stopped. Then the room slowly erupted into murmurs, questions, disbelief. A community realizing they had been manipulated, deceived, and dragged into a conflict they didn't understand. The board, scrambling to regain order, declared an emergency recess. They disappeared into a side room with my documents clutched in their hands, arguing in urgent, hushed tones behind the closed door. I remained where I stood, breath steady, heart pounding, a strange mix of relief and adrenaline coursing through me. The residents watched me, some with gratitude, others with bewildered sympathy, but none with the hostility I had felt for weeks. The narrative had shifted, and everyone knew it. I had walked into the hearing accused, cornered, and alone. I walked out having forced the truth into the light. But as I waited for the board to return, one thought pulsed through my mind louder than all the whispers in that room. If this was the explosion, what would the fallout look like? And how far would the HOA go now that their secret had been exposed? Because the battle was far from over. The real consequences, for them, and for me, were only just beginning. The board returned after 20 tense minutes, though it felt much longer. When they walked back into the room, their expressions told the entire story before a single word was spoken. The vice president carried my documents pressed against her chest, as if they were something fragile, something that needed protecting. The remaining board members followed behind her, avoiding eye contact with each other, their faces tight and conflicted. But the president's chair was empty. When the vice president called the meeting back to order, the shift in power was unmistakable. She cleared her throat, thanked everyone for their patience, and then delivered a statement that changed everything effective immediately. The board was suspending all enforcement actions related to my property. All fines were voided. The compliance hearing was canceled, and a formal review of the fence, the realignment initiative, and the president's conduct would begin. It was the closest thing to an apology I had heard in months. And though they didn't say the words outright, the meaning was unmistakable. They knew the truth. They could no longer hide it. The room erupted into murmurs again, some relieved, some confused, some still processing what they had witnessed. The vice president assured everyone that the board would address the situation transparently moving forward. Her voice was calm but edged with the kind of frustration that suggested she, too, had been kept in the dark. But she wasn't finished. With a deep breath, she announced that the president had chosen to step away from his duties, pending further review. It was the diplomatic phrasing everyone expected, but the reality behind it was obvious. He wasn't coming back. Not after what had been exposed. Not after storming out in front of half the neighborhood. And definitely not after the documents I had provided. It should have felt like victory. Clean, decisive, cathartic. But as I walked out of the community center that night, victory felt heavy, almost fragile. Neighbors approached me cautiously, some apologetic for staying silent, others shocked by the extent of the president's actions. A few thanked me sincerely, their voices low and trembling with relief. They were people who had also been pushed, also been intimidated, also been afraid to speak up. I had gone into the fight thinking I was alone. I wasn't. And that realization made the night feel even heavier. The next morning, everything changed at a pace that felt almost unreal. Contractors arrived under the board's orders to remove the fence. No hesitation. No resistance. They worked quickly, tearing down each post, as if pulling out the roots of a problem that had poisoned the community. I watched from my porch, arms folded, heart steady for the first time in weeks. The gap that remained in the ground looked strange. Raw earth marking where the conflict had taken shape. But it also felt symbolic. Like the ground was breathing again, free from the intrusion that had suffocated it. The board also informed me that I could keep the results of the private survey on file with the HOA. They said it would serve as permanent verification of the boundary, so no future board could challenge it. There was a firmness in their tone that hadn't been there before. A quiet but powerful acknowledgement that what had happened to me would never happen again. In the following days, the truth about the president's motives spread quickly. People who once idolized him now avoided mentioning his name. Residents who had been skeptical of my claims suddenly understood why I had fought so hard. And those who had stayed silent felt a mixture of guilt and admiration. The neighborhood's dynamic shifted, not overnight, but noticeably. As if the illusion of order the president had built was finally cracking open to reveal the truth beneath it. But most unexpectedly, something else changed too. The board's attitude. Without the president, the remaining members seemed lighter, different, almost relieved. It became clear that he had ruled with more control than anyone realized, guiding decisions quietly but forcefully, using his authority to manipulate outcomes that suited his interests. Once he was gone, the rest of the board seemed eager, desperate, even, to rebuild trust with the community. They launched a full internal audit, reviewed old decisions, and reopened grievances residents had long since given up on. They invited feedback. They encouraged participation. They rewrote policies with transparency. And for the first time in years, residents felt like they had a voice again. The HOA wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was finally functioning the way it should have all along, not as a weapon, but as a guardian of shared interests. Meanwhile, the former president quietly put his house up for sale. No announcement. No farewell email. No attempt to reconcile or explain. His once meticulously maintained property grew uncharacteristically neglected as he prepared to move. And even though I didn't know everything he had been planning, the permit denial, the boundary grab, and the desperation he showed that day painted a clear picture. He had wanted more space, more property, more control, more of everything. And he had used the HOA as the tool to get it. But when the truth came out, he couldn't face the consequences, so he ran from them. Seeing the "for sale" sign in his yard stirred complicated emotions. There was relief, yes, and vindication, but also a strange sadness, not for him personally, but for the reminder of how easily a community could be twisted by the wrong person in the wrong position. How quickly order could turn into control. How rapidly trust could become leverage. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal, or at least a version of normal that felt possible again. I cleaned up my yard, repaired the patches of torn earth where the fence had been removed, and reclaimed the part of my property that had been wrongfully taken. The grass grew back, the space opened up again, and the sun fell across it the way it used to. But I wasn't the same person anymore. The quiet, avoid conflict at all costs homeowner who believed that following the rules would protect them had been cracked open. In their place stood someone who understood the importance of vigilance, of boundaries, not just on paper, but in principle, and of standing up even when it feels impossible. Especially then. The board invited me to join a new committee focused on revising HOA bylaws, but I declined. I didn't want power. I didn't want influence. I only wanted peace. Real peace, not the kind enforced by intimidation or hidden agendas. Instead, I offered suggestions, provided feedback, and attended community meetings more regularly. And to my surprise, many residents did the same. The conflict had not just exposed one man's deception, it had shaken the entire neighborhood awake. My story spread far beyond the cul-de-sac. People shared similar experiences. Strangers reached out with sympathy, advice, and sometimes their own horror stories about overreaching HOAs. It made me realize just how common these battles were. How many people had been pressured, silenced, or intimidated by boards that were supposed to represent them. In the months that followed, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, quieter and more respectful. The board operated more transparently. The residents felt more comfortable questioning decisions, and for the first time in a long time, the HOA felt like a real community organization, rather than a shadow looming over everyone's daily lives. Eventually, new neighbors moved into the former president's house. A young family with children who spent their afternoons chalking art on the driveway and chasing each other through sprinklers. Seeing them fill the yard with laughter and light felt like the final seal on the conflict, a reminder that life always moved forward, even after its darkest chapters. But the most surprising part came months later, during the annual HOA meeting. When the vice president, now the newly elected president, stood at the podium, she announced a series of reforms designed to prevent misuse of power. Mandatory transparency laws, clear documentation requirements, strict checks and balances, fair enforcement procedures, and a new rule requiring all board actions affecting property boundaries to be reviewed by both legal counsel and the community before approval. She paused, then looked directly at me as she said it. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't understood before. My fight hadn't just won back 4 feet of land. It had changed the community. It had protected future homeowners. It had exposed a flawed system and forced it to evolve. It had reminded everyone that authority without accountability becomes dangerous, but accountability enforced by ordinary people becomes strength. When I walked home that night, the air felt different. Lighter. Freer. Like the neighborhood had finally taken a breath it didn't even know it had been holding. And as I stepped onto the section of my yard that had once been stolen, I let the weight of everything that had happened settle into a single, powerful truth. Sometimes the battle you never wanted becomes the one that changes everything. And sometimes the smallest boundary, 4 feet of grass, a strip of land most people would overlook, becomes the line that teaches you just how far you're willing to go to protect what's yours. So, the question I leave you with is this: if someone crossed your boundary, literally or figuratively, how far would you go to take it back?